All right, guys, what just happened looks quiet on the surface, but structurally, it changes the game. BRICS did not announce a war, did not threaten sanctions, and did not issue ultimatums. Instead, it announced something far more dangerous to the existing order. A cross-continental energy infrastructure plan designed to function even if every traditional choke point fails. This is not about oil prices spiking tomorrow. It is about who controls flow, dependency, and optionality over the next decade. And that is why this move caught Washington off guard. For years, the assumption was simple. As long as energy moves through global markets priced in dollars and shipped through predictable routes, pressure tools remain effective. Sanctions, financial access, insurance, shipping, all of it depends on friction. What BRICS is signaling now is an attempt to remove friction entirely within its own sphere. Think about what that implies. Energy producers and energy consumers sitting inside the same system. Transport routes that do not need Western insurance. Settlement mechanisms that do not touch the dollar. This is not a declaration. It is architecture. And architecture reshapes behavior quietly before headlines catch up. The reason markets did not immediately panic is because pipelines do not trade like stocks. They sit in the background until they are finished. But once finished, they lock in behavior for decades. That is the key point most people miss. This is not a short-term shock. It is a long-term constraint being built into the system. The moment you remove the need to pass through external bottlenecks, leverage shifts. And leverage is what has underpinned Western energy influence since the end of the Cold War. This is why the meeting itself mattered more than the press release. Energy ministers, producers, and large consumers aligning on logistics, payment, and timing. No slogans, no ideology, just systems. The thesis of this video is simple. This is not about BRICS versus the West in a dramatic sense. It is about the slow replacement of exposure with insulation. And once insulation is in place, pressure loses effectiveness. The rest of this analysis is about how that insulation is being built, layer by layer, and why undoing it later will be far harder than stopping it now. Now let us zoom in on the core mechanism because this is where most commentary goes wrong. People fixate on oil production numbers or daily output. That misses the real source of power. Control over routes matters more than control over wells. A barrel that cannot move freely is not a commodity. It is a hostage to infrastructure. Pipelines, rail links, ports, and power corridors determine who depends on whom. This is why cross-continental pipelines are strategic assets, not economic projects. Once built, they change incentives automatically. Buyers prioritize stability, sellers prioritize certainty, and both sides reduce exposure to external interference. This is the silent leverage embedded in infrastructure. You do not need to threaten anyone. You simply redirect flow. Over time, that redirection becomes normalized. This is exactly what BRICS is attempting to engineer. A network where producers like Russia and the Middle East connect directly to demand centers like China and India without touching vulnerable nodes. The second-order effect is subtle but profound. Once energy starts flowing internally, surplus supply available to external markets becomes less predictable. That does not require collusion. It is a byproduct of optimization. Internal contracts are longer term. External markets absorb volatility. Europe experienced a preview of this dynamic after 2022. The lesson was clear. Access matters more than theoretical supply. What makes this moment different is scale and intent. This is not a single pipeline. It is a coordinated system spanning regions, currencies, and timelines. And because pipelines are capital intensive, once money is committed, reversal becomes irrational. No government builds multi-decade infrastructure planning to abandon it. That is why this move is so difficult to counter after the fact. You cannot sanction concrete already poured. You cannot unwind steel already buried. By the time political responses form, behavior has already shifted. That is the trap. The leverage is not exercised through confrontation. It is exercised through normal operations. That is what makes it resilient. This is also why headlines focusing on whether this will collapse the dollar miss the point. The dollar is not the immediate target. Dependency is. And dependency erodes quietly until one day pressure tools stop working the way they used to. That is the strategic logic behind prioritizing pipelines over price wars. Now let us anchor this in concrete numbers because abstraction hides impact. With the latest expansion, BRICS plus countries account for roughly 40% of global crude oil production and a comparable share of proven reserves. That alone matters, but the real shift is demand alignment. China and India together represent more than a third of incremental global energy consumption growth. When major producers and major consumers operate within the same framework, The marginal barrel behaves differently. Instead of chasing the highest bidder on open markets, it flows toward contractual certainty. That changes market dynamics without any announcement. The first-order consequence is straightforward. Liquidity in external markets tightens during stress, not because oil disappears, but because it is already committed elsewhere. The second-order consequence is pricing power through stability rather than manipulation. When supply outside the system becomes residual, buyers compete for what remains. This is not an old-style cartel, it is structural prioritization. Add to this the fact that several BRICS members also control significant natural gas corridors and electricity interconnections. Energy is no longer a single market, it is layered: oil, gas, power, and eventually hydrogen. The more layers align internally, the less exposed the system becomes. This also explains why financial markets underestimate the move. Traders price spot flows, infrastructure prices decades. The real impact shows up during crises, not during calm periods. That is when optionality matters most. If internal routes absorb shock, external markets absorb volatility. That volatility translates into higher risk premiums, insurance costs, and political pressure for importers. Europe learned how quickly theoretical diversification collapses when physical access is constrained. The United States is more insulated but not immune through allies and pricing mechanisms. The key takeaway from the numbers is not dominance, it is insulation at scale. And insulation reduces sensitivity to pressure. That is the strategic shift underway. It is slow, it is quiet. And by the time it becomes obvious, reversing it will require far more than policy statements or emergency summits. Now the analysis moves into the second layer where the real insulation takes shape: payment and settlement. This is the part that is often misunderstood as an attack on the dollar, but that framing is inaccurate and shallow. What BRICS is constructing is not a replacement of the global financial system, but a parallel circuit that functions when the primary one becomes hostile. Energy traded in local currencies is not about ideology, it is about risk management. When oil or gas is settled in yuan or rupees inside long-term contracts, exposure to sanctions, clearing delays, and asset freezes drops sharply. The first-order effect is stability for participants. The second-order effect is optionality during crises. If pressure rises, trade does not stop. It reroutes. That is the strategic value. History shows that systems rarely collapse from frontal assaults. They erode when alternatives quietly mature. This is exactly what is happening here. Payment systems tied to physical energy flows create habits. Habits become norms. Norms become expectations. Once that sequence locks in, reversing it becomes politically and economically costly. Importantly, this does not require universal adoption. Even partial internalization reduces vulnerability. If a producer knows that a significant share of exports can clear outside the dollar system, negotiating posture changes. Pressure tools lose their immediacy. They still exist, but their bite dulls. Markets respond accordingly by pricing higher political risk into exposed regions. That risk premium does not disappear. It compounds. This is why the move matters even if volumes remain modest at first. The direction of travel is what reshapes expectations. And expectations drive capital allocation. Over time, investment follows systems that promise continuity under stress. That is the quiet advantage of parallel settlement frameworks. They do not need to outperform existing systems in good times. They only need to outperform them in bad times. That is the standard they are being designed to meet. Once energy and payment align internally, the insulation layer thickens. And thick insulation does not announce itself. It simply reduces sensitivity to outside temperature. From here, the picture expands beyond oil and gas into the future energy stack, where the leverage becomes even more asymmetric. While headlines focus on pipelines, the deeper consolidation is happening in minerals, processing, and energy transition inputs. Lithium, cobalt, rare earth elements, graphite, and copper are not substitutes for oil. They are complements to the next system, and control over them defines who captures value from electrification. Several BRICS members sit upstream in this chain. Others dominate refining. Together, they cover a disproportionate share of the mine to factory pipeline. This is not accidental. It reflects a lesson learned from decades of commodity dependence. Value is not extracted at the mine. It is captured at the choke points of processing and scale. When a block controls both ends, it shapes pricing and availability without overt coordination. The first-order effect is supply security for internal manufacturers. The second-order effect is dependency for external ones. A country can design the most advanced battery or turbine, but without steady access to processed inputs, scaling stalls. This creates a structural asymmetry. Innovation alone does not guarantee dominance. Access does. This is where the energy transition narrative collides with geopolitics. The push toward electric vehicles and renewables increases demand for precisely the materials concentrated inside this network. That concentration amplifies leverage over time. Unlike oil, these supply chains take years to replicate. Environmental approvals, capital intensity, and technical expertise create barriers that policy announcements cannot overcome quickly. The result is a quiet lock-in. As production expands, internal demand absorbs output. External buyers face longer lead times and higher costs. Again, no threat is required. The system prioritizes itself. This also explains why diversification strategies announced elsewhere face structural headwinds. Substitutes exist in theory. In practice, they are slower, smaller, and more expensive. The takeaway here is not inevitability, it is inertia. Once capital and expertise cluster, momentum carries forward. That momentum is now being aligned with energy infrastructure and payment systems. The layers reinforce each other. Energy feeds industry. Industry feeds demand. Demand feeds investment. And investment feeds control. That loop is what BRICS is trying to close internally before external pressures intensify. At this point, it is essential to slow down and examine the fault lines because no system of this scale moves without friction. The strength of this alignment is also its vulnerability. BRICS is not a unified state. It is a collection of countries with competing priorities, historical tensions, and asymmetric needs. Producers want high prices and guaranteed demand. Consumers want low prices and flexibility. Those incentives collide over time. Infrastructure does not eliminate bargaining. It shifts where it happens. Internal disputes over pricing formulas, capacity allocation, and investment burden are inevitable. The first-order risk is delay. Large cross-continental projects are complex and expensive. Cost overruns and political changes can stall timelines. The second-order risk is fragmentation. If trust erodes, parallel routes compete rather than complement. That weakens the insulation effect. There is also the question of capital discipline. Building redundant systems requires sustained funding over decades. That assumes stable governance and policy continuity across multiple countries. History suggests this is difficult. External pressure can paradoxically increase internal strain by forcing faster alignment than institutions can support. This is where the strategy will be tested, not by Western response, but by internal coherence. The system only works if participants accept trade-offs. That means consumers accepting less flexibility and producers accepting less spot market upside. Whether that balance holds remains uncertain. This uncertainty is often overlooked by critics and supporters alike. The correct framing is not triumph or failure. It is execution risk. High ambition amplifies both upside and downside. If coordination holds, insulation deepens. If it fractures, exposure returns. That is the real hinge. This is why the next phase matters more than the announcement itself. Construction timelines, contract structures, and dispute resolution mechanisms will determine outcomes. The blueprint is clear. The question is whether the political economy can support it long enough to become irreversible. Until that answer emerges, the system remains in transition, powerful in concept but unproven in practice. Now the consequences move outward, and this is where the strategic picture becomes impossible to ignore for the United States, Europe, and the rest of the world. For decades, Western energy security rested on a simple assumption that global markets remain open and fungible, supply could be rerouted, prices could adjust, and liquidity would absorb shocks. That assumption weakens when a large share of producers and consumers prioritize internal routes first. The immediate impact is not collapse, it is exposure. Europe already experienced this when replacement options existed in theory, but not at scale when needed. Liquefied gas arrived, but at higher prices and with intense competition. That experience reshaped budgets, politics, and industrial planning. What BRICS is building extends that logic globally. If internal contracts absorb volatility, external buyers become residual participants during stress. The first-order effect is higher and more volatile costs. The second-order effect is political pressure to subsidize energy and protect industry. Over time, that erodes competitiveness. The United States is more insulated due to domestic production, but remains linked through allies' pricing benchmarks and capital markets. No major economy operates in isolation. The deeper shift occurs in the global south. For many countries, this alignment offers an alternative path that does not require choosing sides overtly. Access to energy financing and infrastructure without extensive conditions is attractive. That creates a new center of gravity. Countries rich in resources gain leverage as partners rather than suppliers. This does not mean alignment against the West. It means optionality. Optionality reshapes diplomacy quietly. When alternatives exist, negotiation dynamics change. This is the multipolar reality taking shape. Not blocks sealed off from each other, but overlapping systems competing for participation. The security dimension follows naturally. Energy routes demand protection. Sea lanes, ports, pipelines, and grids become strategic priorities. Naval presence increases not for confrontation, but for assurance. The map of energy becomes the map of security interest. This linkage does not guarantee conflict, it increases stakes. The system rewards restraint and coordination because disruption hurts all participants. The risk is miscalculation when assumptions lag reality. If policy continues to assume frictionless markets while infrastructure locks in preferences elsewhere, responses arrive late. The lesson here is adaptation. Energy strategy, industrial policy, and diplomacy must align with physical realities, not financial abstractions. The world is not running out of energy. It is reorganizing access. That distinction matters. So we arrive at the final layer where scenarios matter more than predictions. There are 3 plausible paths forward, and none of them are simple. In the first scenario, coordination inside the network holds. Infrastructure is completed, payments mature, and internal demand absorbs increasing volumes. The result is not dominance, but insulation. External markets remain functional, but more volatile. Pressure tools still exist, but with diminishing returns. In the second scenario, execution falters. Delays, disputes, and capital constraints slow projects. Internal trade grows, but unevenly. The system remains partially exposed. This creates a prolonged transition with uncertainty rather than resolution. Volatility rises without a clear new equilibrium. The third scenario is counterintuitive. External pressure accelerates internal compromise. Faced with shared risk, participants accept trade-offs faster than expected. Coordination improves precisely because alternatives look worse. In that case, insulation deepens more quickly than markets anticipate. Which path emerges depends on discipline, patience, and governance. None of these outcomes are predetermined. What is clear is the direction of incentives. Systems that reduce exposure to single points of failure gain appeal. Energy infrastructure payment frameworks and supply chains are being designed with that principle in mind. This does not end globalization. It reshapes it into overlapping circuits. The core thesis of this video is not about winners and losers. It is about structure. When structure changes, behavior follows. Quietly at first, then, all at once during stress. The mistake is to treat this as a headline event rather than a construction process. The real consequences show up years later, embedded in contracts, routes, and habits. As policymakers, investors, and citizens, the question is not whether this shift is happening. It is how prepared existing systems are to operate within it. Can diversification keep pace with consolidation elsewhere? Can cooperation substitute for dependence? Can innovation overcome access constraints? Those questions will define outcomes far more than rhetoric. So here are the questions I want you to think about. If energy access becomes the primary source of leverage in a multipolar world, which systems are truly resilient? And if pressure tools lose effectiveness, what replaces them as instruments of influence? Let me know what you think in the comments below. Stay safe. Be sure to smash the like button and subscribe as we navigate through these crazy times.